Hi guys, welcome back. I want to talk about topic 2.3, island biogeography today. This is a concept that's tucked all the way at the end of chapter 6. Um, and it's a pretty simple idea, but it has a lot of implications in conservation and management and things like that. It was proposed by MacArthur and Wilson. Wilson, this is the scientist who, for some of you, I assigned the film called The Guide. So he's the elderly scientist who inspired Tonga to become a biologist. If you're in period one, I didn't assign this yet, but I will eventually because it's a really good film. Um, anyway, so island biogeography basically says it talks about the size of the island and the distance of the island to the mainland, and how that impacts biodiversity in those islands. So you can have islands that are large, or you can have islands that are small. You can have islands that are far away, or islands that are close to the mainland, right? So we're assuming that islands are new habitats. Generally, when an island forms, it doesn't have any species on it. It has to be colonized, right? And the source of these species is a mainland somewhere. So in order for these species to get here, they have to, you know, fly, or they might accidentally get stuck on a vegetation that floats over there or something like that. It's a chance event that these islands gets colonized. So the closer the island it is to the mainland, the higher the likelihood that the island is going to be colonized. So you're going to have greater number of species making it to an island if it's closer to the source, right? That makes sense. Um, Size also plays a role because larger the island, more likely organisms will get there because there's more surface for them to get to. And also, once they get there, likelihood that these species will survive and persist is greater because larger the habitat, greater the resources, and greater the variety of habitats and things like that. So it has to do with the distance, the size, and how that impacts colonization and extinction rates. Okay. So they um, summarize it in this graph, which I kind of find a little confusing, but you should kind of understand what it's trying to say here. So on the x-axis here, you have the number of species going from few to many. Okay. Um, and you have two axes. One represents the rate of immigration, so, colonization rates. And then the other axis is the rate of extinction, so extinction rates. And you have these lines representing the different types of islands. So you got these lines as representing the distance, and this is the axis for that. And these orange lines are representing size, and that's the kind of the dependent variable for that, right? um and where these lines cross is where you will find a number of species. So for example, if here you have a island that's far away, that's also small, it's going to have the lowest number of species. On the other end of the spectrum, you have islands that are close to the mainland, like here, but they're large. Those are going to have the greatest number of species, and you got things in between. Okay, so that's the kind of the theory behind island biogeography. Well, islands aren't just islands in the middle of the oceans like this. Ecological islands are islands that are habitat that's surrounded by like non-habitats or like different habitat. So the organisms that are in here are essentially stuck there, like they are confined in that area, because the area surrounding it is not hospitable for that organism. So Central Park in New York City is a island, right? You have this area of habitat that's surrounded by, this a sea of concrete, which is not um, the same type of habitat, right? The organisms that are here has to um, be colonized here somehow. Maybe, oftentimes probably maybe introduced by people, but they still have to somehow get here. Okay. Um, and we're constantly creating islands. We might create an island by developing or converting habitats into farmlands and things like that, and leaving small patches. So these are also islands, and we can also create islands by fragmenting habitats. So just building roads and things that actually splits the habitat into two. Now you have two separate habitats, and depending on some organisms, some can move across these boundaries, but some can't. And you're essentially isolating organisms into these habitats by fragmenting them. So this is a process called islandization. It's like formation of islands. Okay. Um, so there is this ongoing debate. Well, I don't know if it's ongoing. Well, there used to be a debate about conservation and whether or not it's better to have a single large habitat or several small habitats. And oftentimes, when we're faced with conserving natural areas for wildlife, um, I mean, oftentimes it's whatever you can, and you don't have a choice between doing these. Um, but if there was a choice, or if you have to think about it, is it better to have one large intact ecosystem, or try to have several small ones that collectively might have a large area? Right. It's actually turns out to be not a simple solution. It really depends. And these are some of the things that you got to think about. So generally, so at least according to MacArthur and Wilson's the biogeography theory, larger the habitat, the more diverse it's going to be. So larger habitat is going to be able to support greater diversity. Of species. So in that sense, single large would be a better thing, right? Um, because when you have smaller habitats, you're going to have something called edge effect. So you're going to create more edge, right? So here, explain a little bit more here. Edge effect is when you fragment a habitat, you create these edges, and now edges are going to have a slightly different characteristics than the interior of the ecosystem. It's an ecotone, right? So it's a transition between two ecosystems, um, and in and there are certain species that are better adapted and might thrive in these edge habitats, and these are called edge species. And so that will be good for them, but you also end up losing um, the interior, because once you fragment it, you make the interior smaller. You increase the edge, but you decrease the size of the the interior of the habitat. And there are some species that need these type conditions that are only found in the interior of the habitat. Maybe they might be shy, they need certain tree covers, and things like that. And by fragmenting, you're reducing that size. And again, we talked about how some organisms need that space. Maybe they need a certain amount of territory, they need a certain amount of land to forage, and things like that. So these guys will be more negatively affected by fragmentation. Right. Like I said, these edge habitats will actually benefit from fragmentation. By the way, these edge species are, ones that we're very familiar with. These are things like deer and rabbits and raccoons. These actually organisms thrive in edge habitats, and these numbers increase when you fragment an ecosystem, and as you start losing some of the interior species. And just the law of surface area to volume ratio, it applies to um, to this here too, where the smaller the habitat, greater the proportional not surface area, in this case is the edge perimeter. um, so that's what happens. as a result of fragmentation. So, based on that, having many small will be disadvantageous to some of the species that are in um, that lives in the interior. Okay, so depending on what you're trying to protect, it might be, like I said, great for edge species, not good for some others. Um, when you have one large habitat, it's easier for things like diseases and pests to um, spread because they're all intact. If it's isolated, these diseases and pests could also stay isolated as well. So that's an argument for having several small, right? And oftentimes, small islands, because their habitat is unique, especially these kind of islands, often will have unique species. These endemic species are only found in this particular habitat. Um, and those tend to get lost when you start connecting them because other organisms from other habitats or invade. You're going to have invasives coming in that might drive out the native endemic species. So sometimes having isolated um, habitats like this is a good thing. Many small islands often have very unique species of birds and other animals that are only found on that island and nowhere else. And that's because they evolved separately from the rest, the other places. And um, collectively, if you have a lot of those small islands, you could have a larger diversity than if this was all one big one. So, there's no right or wrong answer about which one is better over the other. It really depends on the situation. Um, I think I should have assigned there's a wonderful video by HHMI that talks about island biogeography and the implications of that in conservation. And it features E.O. Wilson. He's talking about his experiment on biogeography. So it's a great one. I really like videos that features the original scientists who came up with these theories and to have them talk about how their initial idea has been applied to many situations. Um, so yeah. Yeah, so the video also talks about something called wildlife corridors, which are so if you have these isolated habitats, right, connecting them is one of the ways to make the habitat larger, so that these populations that are isolated um, and because small populations like this are isolated could go locally extinct. Because they could maybe deplete the resources and or something might happen, but if they're connected they can move, and that will support greater diversity. um, so oftentimes human activities will fragment these habitats and isolate these populations. So one of the ways to mitigate that is to build these corridors. So creating protecting habitats in between to kind of expand the habitat, or even just building these bridges that will connect, because we can see this highways really splitting this two pieces of habitat into separate areas. And you know by having these corridors or these bridges, these organisms can cross over and have access to the resources on the other side. Okay, let's do some questions. Yeah, I'm going to have you just read that and answer the questions. This one is talking about distance, right? The impact of distance on the number of species. All right, next question. This one's looking at size. And last question. Okay, so that is it for topic what number was it? I lose track of the numbers. Topic 2.3. Yeah, I'm sorry. I I'm skipping around and going back and forth between the different topics. Um, I'm just arranging in a way that makes a little bit more sense to me. So, okay, I'll see you later. Bye.